Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Jeremy, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on here, Mr. New York. I was just out there a while ago, lapping it up. I love New York City, man. It's really good. New York's really good, like in the spring, in the fall, when like the leaves change and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Then I like to retreat out here to Scottsdale in the winter, so I don't have to freeze to death like you.
Yeah, that's true. Now we're like lucky to be entering fall in New York, which is really nice and definitely an acquired taste. I've been here for 12 years, but I'm thinking maybe about the next move. So
well, hey, you get, move somewhere, move to sunny Florida or Arizona in the winters and spend your springs and your summers and early fall there, man. Have the best of both worlds.
exactly. Yeah. Just being able to use seasons as verbs is a good goal in life, I think. Right. So makes a lot of sense. So Jeremy, this is always a productive topic for us on the show. I think these topics tend to do really well, which is sales, right? Like this thing that never goes away, that as business owners or of course as salespeople, we always have to think about. So before we get into questions, if you wouldn't mind talking about your high level background and how you got here and all that good stuff.
Oh, good. I'll give a basic overview so I don't bore everybody to death. But I got into sales probably it's about 22 years ago. Burned out college student, and I got my first job. You always get the first job, anything you can get, selling home security systems door to door. So, my roommate came into the dorm and he's like, hey, there's this meeting here and they've got free food and you can make all this money in the summer and you don't have to work while you're going to college. And I'm like, okay, I'll go. You get there, they dog and pony show. They basically hire everyone because it's straight commission. So if you don't sell, like they don't care, right? And basically a couple months later, I get shipped out to Boise, Idaho. They drive you out in a van in the middle of the neighborhood. And they basically, you had a script and all that stuff you had to memorize in the books from the old sales gurus. And they basically kick you out the door and be like, hey, go make some sales. You're going to do great. We'll pick you up after dark, and that was my experience. And I remember like knocking on the first door. I remember my sales manager was like, you got to be really, really excited. Like show them your enthusiasm about the product and they're going to be excited. They're going to invite you in the home. So I started doing that from door number one. And I found out very quickly that wasn't necessarily the case. I felt like I'd been lied to. I started getting all these objections like, we can't afford it. We don't need it. Your price is too high. I need to keep doing research. I need to keep looking around. I need to talk with my spouse. Let me think it over. Can you call me back in a week, a month, a year later? And I finally got to a point, I would say probably about 7 to 8 weeks in of really hardly making any sales. When you're straight commission, you don't make sales, you don't get paid, right? So I got to a point, I remember like one night, Friday night, van's coming around to pick me up, manager's waiting on me. And I remember sitting there on the curb, like, if you imagine even imagine New York, the hot July humidity. So I'm like sweating there, just my legs feel like jello. I'm like rubbing my feet into the hot concrete. And I remember sitting there after making no sales that day. So I worked 12 hours, 0 sales. That week, in fact, I worked the whole week and it made 0 sales. So I made $0. And I remember thinking, maybe selling just wasn't for me, right? And so he picked me up and he popped in this Tony Robbins CD. Okay. I love Tony. And Tony said something like this. I might be butchering what he said, but he said, most people fail for the simple reason they don't learn the right skills necessary to succeed. They don't learn the right skills. So when I heard that, it was like the heavens opened. It was like divine intervention, like some light bulb went off in my head of cobwebs that basically said, maybe what the company was training me, maybe what I was learning from, like I said, sometimes back here, these books, the old sales gurus, maybe they just weren't the right skills. Maybe they were just outdated. Maybe they just didn't work very well anymore. So I committed to myself at that point that I was going to have to learn more advanced skills. Now, at the same time, this is kind of crazy. My background, what I studied in college was behavioral science and human psychology. So my professors were telling me and teaching us in these classes that the most persuasive way, the way the brain makes decisions in a human being was over here. Whereas the sales gurus, they were telling in their books that it was over here. It's like completely opposite. So I'm like, how is this possible? So I'm like, how do I take what I'm learning in behavioral science and psychology and wrap that into my sales process? Okay. And that's what I started doing. Okay. And overnight, I went from like the worst salesperson in the company of probably like 400 salespeople to number one in like probably about 3 months. And people are like, who is this kid? What's going on? But it was because I was learning how to get my prospects to pull me in rather than trying to push them. Okay. Learning how to work with human behavior rather than triggering sales resistance, which we'll probably talk about today. And, when you learn how to do that, selling becomes very, very easy and very, very profitable. Are you with me?
I am. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And it's funny because there's a close friend of mine that got his start selling security systems door to door in Florida. And he had crazy stories. He had a story about working with like ex-cons and meth heads, and one guy that literally overdosed on caffeine, went to the hospital, went back to work, closed another 5 deals. And it's crazy because it was completely undifferentiated as a product and everything. But basically the company succeeded on the strength of sales process alone. So I could imagine that being almost like Navy SEAL buds training or something like that.
Yeah, it was just like a numbers game, right? They had so many salespeople that luck of the draw, you knock on a door and they just had a break in the night before and they're scared to death.
Yeah.
So those were the easy sales, but you weren't really selling anybody else with the way they were teaching you how to say. You had to knock on 100 doors, talk to 80 people to make one sale. And that's just, it's like pounding your head against the brick wall behind, hoping and praying that something you're going to say is going to trigger your prospects to want to buy. And that's such a hard and unpredictable way to make a living. You just
and to go back to what changed. So you had this moment, you're out on the curb and you're like, I need to learn new skills. I need to be pulled in instead of push. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how did you adjust your process and how does that inform what you're teaching people now?
Yeah. And, I had a 17-year sales career, did work very well financially. I actually retired in my late 30s and was kind of sitting around one day after about a year of just, what am I going to do? Am I just going to hang out for a couple more years? I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I was getting into real estate and other stuff, as far as like buying properties and stuff. But I started seeing like all these ads on social media from the gurus telling people how to sell certain ways. And I'm like, if I sold that way, I would have made like 5% of the income I did. Like that's just like so old school or repackaged consultative selling techniques that have been around since the dinosaur ages. That just very hard to sell to people like that. Let's do this. This might be more appropriate. So when I was in behavioral science back in college, which is really, if you think about it, it's really the study of the brain. It's the study of how a human being makes a decision, okay? Which is really persuasion, right? Because we're all persuaded, we're all moved, we're all convinced to do one thing or the other. That's from everything from making our buying decisions at the grocery store to what car we're going to drive, to who you're going to vote for if you're in politics, right? Your brain is making those decisions. So how do you influence the brain? So according to behavioral science, there are actually 3 forms of persuasion. Okay. So everybody listening, watching us right now, if you're not driving, write these down, because once you understand the differences in persuasion and where you are now in your current sales ability, even if you're doing good compared to where you could be, it'll completely change everything for you, right? So the first mode of sales, we would call that era 1 type of selling. I'm not going to give the scientific terms because it wouldn't make any sense. But if I said boiler room selling, what's the first image that comes to your mind?
The call center and stressed out people. Yeah.
Or like Wolf on Wall Street type of thing,
sure.
Right? Those shows are like, hey, I've got a great opportunity for you. And then we talk about the features and the benefits of what we do. And then we push and tell them why they need to buy and why they need to go with us. And it's just like, if you told your spouse, I know you just got recently married, congratulations.
Hey.
If you told your spouse, you really, really need to do something, and then you keep pushing, what do they typically do back?
They push back.
They push back. It's just human behavior 101. I'm just surprised salespeople have never caught on to that. They're like, oh, I'm just going to push. And somehow they're not going to push back. They're just going to lay down. All right. So I'll give you a few examples of the least persuasive way to sell. Presenting. Okay. We're all taught that you have to have an amazing presentation. You got to have the 60 to 90 minute slide deck and all the slides. And here's our corporate office. And here's our customer service awards for the best quality. And here's our clients. And we have the best this and we have the best that. Which, by the way, how many salespeople say that their product or service is the best?
Most of them.
Pretty much everybody, right?
Yeah.
Everybody says that, right? So when we say that we have the best quality, we have the best customer service, we have the best prices, psychologically, just so we all know, your prospect actually trusts you less. What? People are like, what? How? Because they're used to every salesperson in every company and every ad they've ever seen saying that they have the best. So when we say things like everybody else says, we just water it down, especially if you're talking down about your competition. Your prospects will trust you less, okay? So according to the data, it's not very persuasive if your presentation is more than 10% of your entire sales process. Now, here's the problem. The average salesperson worldwide in any industry, B2C or B2B, their sales presentation is typically about 50% of everything they do. And that is a massive issue, okay? People tune in, they just don't tune into that, all right, emotionally. Telling your story. Hate to tell everybody, nobody cares about your story when you're selling one-to-one. Whose story do they mainly care about?
Their own.
Their own story. Giving a sales pitch. We've all been taught you've got to give a great pitch. According to the science, very low on the persuasive poll. You ever watch that show on CNBC, Shark Tank?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you got the Mark Cuban and Damon John and Barbara and Mr. Wonderful and all those people. I want you to watch, everybody watch their body language when the entrepreneurs come out and they're all excited, enthusiastic, and they start pitching. I want you to watch how they react to that, okay? That's how your prospects react to you when you start doing the same thing, all right? And the big one is assuming the sale. According to the data, very low on the persuasion poll, especially, and I know most of your audience is kind of more B2B, especially if you're in more of a complex selling environment that requires multiple touches. You're going to work with that client over, months and years. You're not just going to sell something and never talk to them. Okay, now that's the first form of communication. The second form of communication would be more known as, I would say, consultative selling, right? Okay, we're more persuasive when we attempt to have a discussion. Came out in the 80s, lots of different books, lots of different authors. I'd say a big one would be like Spin Selling. Okay, Neil Rackham, college professor, did a study, never actually sold anything, but he taught that you had to ask logical-based questions to find out the needs of the client, which makes sense on the surface. But what's a potential downfall of this approach if you only ask logical-based questions? Okay, we call those surface-level questions, where your prospect is going to give you what type of answers in return?
Surface level answers.
Surface level answers. Right. and if your prospects, we all know this, if your prospect stays surface level with you, what type of objections do you typically get at the end of your sales process? I want to think it over. We're still looking around. We need to get more quotes. We need to do more research, right? It's because you couldn't take them below the surface. They never opened up to you. Like, people are not just going to magically open up to, John, what's 2 problems that keep you awake at night? They're not going to go, they're just going to stay surface with you because they know those are just sales questions that have been around for 100 years,
Yeah. So to dig into that a little bit, how much do you differentiate between sales situations? I think a lot of the times in our world, people are like, great, this works. Maybe this works for selling cars, but I need to get the CMO and 5 other people into this room for this and that process in order to sell a multi-billion-dollar engagement. And by the way, the only objection anybody has is, am I going to get fired? That's the only thing that in a B2B situation, the people bring up, or at least that's the common understanding. So first, let me back up a little bit. Do you agree with that? Do you think that is the primary concern in B2B, or are there other things that are on the radar? Yeah.
According to Forbes, there's 158 industries, only 158, which I found that surprising. There's subsets of those industries. We train every one of those. Okay. Yeah. So we have about 40% of our clients are in like the B2B world, and about close to 60% are in the B2C world. Okay. We get results really for every type of business. It doesn't really matter when you have a sales process. There's going to be different concerns and objections sometimes. Yeah. You're not necessarily going to have like, oh, we don't have enough money for this until I get my paycheck. Obviously, you're not going to have that if you're selling to an enterprise level account. But, your objection might be them opening up and telling you who the other decision makers, influencers are in that company or that organization. Because, the average company in North America, this is not even enterprise, just the average company has 6.7 decision makers or influencers. Okay, that's just a regular company, all right? So if we don't know how to navigate into that organization and get the first, let's say you're talking to a C-level executive on that first discovery call, right? Who's been tasked to finding a company to help them solve some type of problem they think they have, okay? Which most companies don't even know what real problems they have in the beginning, but that's another story, right? So how do you get that C-level executive to start going up the chain where you get other, not just even decision makers involved, But influencers, let's say you're in,
Yeah.
you're selling some type of software that has to be installed. How do you get other people that are going to be working on that and training that involved, who can't make the decision, but could probably influence that decision,
Right.
because they might feel that they're going to get fired if that new software comes in, because now they're going to be found out that they don't really need that person, right? So there's a lot of, as you know, coming from a B2B background, there's a lot of things that go in that. So instead of asking surface level questions like, well, who besides you would be involved in this decision? Because most are not going to open up to that. They're like, oh, well, me, and well, there's a few other people. They're just not going to open up. I have to basically get them to engage with us. I have to disarm them. You were talking about that before. We have to disarm them to let their guard down, where they trust us, right? And that's not talking about how's the weather over there in Dallas, or, how you doing today, John? No, but everybody knows you're not generally interested in how they're doing. But we have to take them through a process where they open up, and then towards the end of that, we might relanguage that question to, John, can you walk me through your organization's decision-making process when it comes to solving problems like this? That's more of a question that gets them to open up a little bit. Now, we can't hardcore try to close them and assume everything we're doing the whole time and then ask a question like that and think they're going to open up.
Yeah.
We have to get them to open up from the very first words and questions out of our mouth to get them to even give that information towards
Right. And I think that's a really good point. But and tied to that is the emotional element. And I think that's the disconnect that I sometimes feel, and that a lot of people in a B2B space feel, which is so much of sales training, and not just you, but the space writ large has been find this emotional connection, right? But then you're on the call, and yeah, if you're selling to the owner of a business, you can find that emotional connection. Hey, I want to retire in 5 years. I want to expand my business. But if you're selling to somebody in middle management or whatever, it's well, they just kind of want to not get fired. And,
well, they have different motivations.
Yeah.
You have to know
right.
what is behind the why of each person you're talking to, because it's all different. That's, like you said, that C-level executive that you're first talking to, their why might be finding a solution to solve some type of major problem so they look good to their boss and get promoted. Now, that next decision maker they bring in that's the head of IT, their thing might be like, man, I don't want to get fired if this goes wrong and I get blamed because I don't know how to train them. So they're motivated differently too. And you have to understand how to navigate and know who's motivated at what stage. Because if you don't, you're basically guessing and you're winging it, and you're just kind of praying it all works out, and you have no control of that situation. Not a good spot to be in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think that a lot of the times there's a lot of people kind of concerned about what they sell, right? Especially in the agency space. There's so many services, there's so much bundling, there's a million ways you could slice or dice this depending on the situation and that kind of thing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How much does the offer matter? The best salesperson you've ever met, Jeremy, can they overcome a bad offer or a bad service and still make it work? Or
100%. That's one of the biggest things that when we go in and audit companies and we listen to salespeople and then they come and tell us what's going on, what's the number one thing they blame? The company's leads, the product's not good, the services are not that good. And so then they see a flashy new company that has, oh, I think that product's better, I'm going to go sell for them. And then they get over there after a month or two, like, well, they still have objections, they still have things they might be a little bit differently, but it all comes back 95% of the time to who? The salesperson's lack of sales ability. Okay, their lack of sales ability to be able to understand the right questions to ask at the right time with the right tonality at certain injunction parts of that conversation and or conversations that trigger the prospect to want to open up. So it's their lack of sales ability. They don't know how to work with human behavior. It's not their fault. Most of them have been forced to learn old school sales techniques or some form of repackaged consultative selling. And they think if they ask a question, what's 2 challenges you're having, that Jane is just going to somehow magically want to open up. And Jane doesn't want to, because they've heard that same stupid question a billion times. So it always comes back to their lack of sales ability. Okay. Once you learn advanced skills from where you are now, so we call that neuro-emotional persuasion question, the third form of communication, dialogue, right? When you ask what are called neuro-emotional persuasion questions, that stands for NEPQ. All right. So how do we get somebody to pull us in? How do we ask the right questions? Where do we ask the right tone? Where do we clarify? Where do we probe that triggers them to actually want to open up? And when you learn those type of skills It doesn't really matter if you sell life insurance to, if you sell cars, if you sell cybersecurity to banks, if you sell medical device to hospitals, it's all the same. If you sell SaaS, you can jump from any industry and be a top 1% earning salesperson once you understand human behavior.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to make that a little more tangible, not to put you on the spot, but is there an example where you've suggested a rephrasing of a question you can think of where it's like somebody was asking it this way and then you said ask it that way and it changed the result? I'd love to just understand like how this is kind of playing out.
Yeah, well, there's a billion of those, but like our methodology, neuro-emotional persuasion questions starts. I'll give you a basic overview. It starts with connecting questions. Okay, we have to have a sales process. All right, if we're just out there talking and just winging it, you're going to have some months that are decent and some months are bad. Like you're not a sales professional. Okay, you're going to get canned pretty quick. All right, so we start with what are called connecting questions. Connecting questions take the focus off you. Put it on the prospect, okay? We're not talking about questions about who won the game last night or how's the weather over there or how you doing. Like I said, your prospects don't engage from that because every salesperson asks them that. So I might get on a call, okay? And like I said, I'll give you an industry specific example. I'll kind of show you a frame. So we call these what are called status frames. Now, a lot of salespeople have been taught from different methodologies to get on the call and say, at the end of this call, it's either we're going to move forward, we're a good fit, we're not a good fit, and it's going to be a yes or no, no think it over. There's some version of that. You never want to do that because that just triggers your prospect to emotionally shut down because they know what you're going to try to do at the end of the call, right? You're going to try to close them on the next step or close them on the deal if you're selling B2C. It just depends. So I'm going to relanguage that. And I might say, let's say if you sell business consulting, okay? Let's say you sell business consulting to firms. Let's say you sell business consulting to SMBs who are really trying to scale their company. They're just stuck. They don't have the right systems and processes in place to scale. Let's say you're a salesperson that does that. So after I get on there's a couple connecting questions. Then I'm going to set a frame. And I might be like, really this call is, I would say it's pretty basic. It's more for us to find out more about kind of what you're doing now to really grow the company, like really scale compared to where you guys are wanting to get the company to, just so we can kind of see what that gap looks like to make sure we can actually help. And then at that point, towards the end of the call, if you feel like, this might be what you're looking for, we can talk about possible next steps. Would that help you? Now, nobody's going to say, nope, that would not help me to talk about possible next steps, right? So I'm setting that frame in the beginning. Now, notice the words I used at the very end of there. Now, towards the end of the call, if you feel that it might be, now might be is the key word. Might be is a neutral word. If I relanguaged it and I said, towards the end of the call, if this is what you're looking for, we're going to talk about the next steps to work together. That's what most salespeople would say. And with a lot of A-level type of executives, that's going to trigger them to like, whoa, like emotionally shut down. But if I neutralize that term, we call it neutral languaging. Towards the end of the call, if you feel that it might be what you're looking for, we can talk about possible next steps. Would that help you? See how that's neutral?
Right.
No, and everybody's like, yeah, that would help me. Okay. So just relanguaging some of the wording there in a same type of frame triggers the prospect to engage more. Now, there's more of that process to keep opening them up. We always call that, I've got it on the board here. I did a training on this yesterday. We talk about following the ABDs of selling. Always be disarming. Most sales trainers talk about what? The ABCs of closing. Always be closing, right? That's like you look at it, you're like, that doesn't even work. Like everybody knows that, especially in B2B sales. You're always closing, you're out the door. You're always out the door. That's what I say. So we want to follow the ABDs of selling. Always be disarming.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. And I've found that myself. And, there's different methodologies to call out different things, but the idea of setting up the call the right way and kind of setting the frame for it is so important. And to shift gears a little bit, I think a big situation that a lot of our audience deals with is even in companies where they might be leading this company for like many years, they might have dozens of employees, is there's an owner that has been doing the selling for so long. And maybe a lot of the business comes from that person's network or referrals, but it seems like there's a lot of stuff that they can kind of get away with, right? Because they own the company, they know the product so well. And then it comes time to get out of that seat and they struggle, right? We talked to a lot of people that have hired and fired multiple salespeople. nobody could get it right. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like if I'm an owner, I want to get out of this sales seat. What are the building blocks that need to be in place, and what sort of quality should I be looking for in that sales hire, if that makes sense? So that's not too hard of a
Well,
question.
first of all, I mean, it's, one of the main questions that we teach employers to ask salespeople that they're interviewing is this one question: how much money did you personally invest in learning advanced skills so you could sell more in the last 12 months?
Yeah.
Okay. And if that salesperson comes back and says, well, I bought a book at Barnes & Noble for $18 and the company brought in a guy for a 2-day seminar, that's not really somebody that we're probably going to hire. Now, there's certain circumstances that maybe that person's really good, right? They have a huge track record and they're selling millions of dollars a year. That's a possibility. But more than likely, they've never really invested in their education. They're not 99% of the time. All right. But if a salesperson is like, you know what, I bought this course for $3,000. I paid this advanced sales coach this much. I've went to 7 seminars. I've read, 15 books. That tells us that that person's more serious about their career. They're actually a sales professional. They're not just getting into sales so they can try to get promoted to management like a few months later, and they have no interest in being sales. That's not a person you definitely want to hire to really help scale your business. So you got to hire the right people, but you got to train them the right skills. If Michael Jordan says it best in his biography. He says, look, you can take 1,000 jump shots a day, but if your technique is off, if your technique is wrong, you're still going to suck at basketball. And so many salespeople get this idea that like, oh, I've got to put on my hustle muscle and I've just got to work hard and just call, and it's all going to work out. And they're broke. Because it doesn't matter how much you journal or how much you listen to AC/DC before you get on your calls, or how much you get pumped up by some motivational CD you pop in or some YouTube video. None of that matters when your prospect says hello and you don't know what to say and ask that triggers the prospect to let their guard down and want to engage and open up to you. You're going to get slapped in the face if you don't learn the right skills. You're going to just keep going around being broke all the time, jumping from opportunity to opportunity, thinking it's not your fault. It's the leads, it's the company, it's the product. And you're just never going to be successful like salespeople who take their career seriously and invest in the right skills. Like they just make 10 times more.
Yeah, and I always find it interesting where I'll talk to owners and salespeople that have been doing this for a while, and I'll ask, "What have you guys ever invested in sales training?" And I'll just the frequency of no's that I hear, and I'm just thinking like, if this increases your success by a single digit percentage, you're talking about in the B2B world, millions and millions of dollars, right? And meanwhile, there's training in just about every other discipline. They're doing marketing training, there's operational training, but there's somehow this resistance. And do you have any ideas, like when you encounter resistance, not even just to your offer, but to sales training writ large, like what is going on there in your estimation?
Like I said, a lot of it is just, let's say they're talking to a salesperson, selling sales training. A lot of it usually is a salesperson just doesn't know how to open the prospect up. They don't know how to build a gap, right? So let's say that company is, I'm just going to throw out different numbers. Let's say that they're making $50 million a year in sales right now, and they just stuck there. They're just stagnating, and they want to get to $150 million a year. It's really, so what do you feel like your salespeople are saying and or not asking that's keeping you stuck at $50 million a year? So questions, just even little questions like that, where they start to conceptualize that there may be the reason why they're here is because their salespeople are maybe saying things or not asking the right questions that if they learned, they could be here. So it's questions, so walk me through, if I came to work for your company today as a new salesperson, what would my sales training consist of? What would it look like? We trained a Fortune 100 company that I asked that question. So our very first B2B client, this was 4 years ago when I founded the company, it was me, my assistant for my job that I brought over, and a part-time salesperson. Now we have like 115 employees, all right? Things can change quick. But I remember this Fortune 100 company. It is a search engine, a very large search engine. Everybody probably knows the name. And I remember sitting there. I got a referral in there because one of my friends was a very top executive for this company. They knew I was very successful selling. They're like, hey, I think you could really help this company. So they bring me in, and I asked that question. And you know what? They basically told me that they do product training. that they bring in salespeople and they teach them how the the AdWords accounts work and inbound and the cloud services and all this mumbo jumbo, but there was no sales training at all. And we started getting on there, looking at their scripts, and they're like 2 or 3 paragraph scripts where they're just talking. They sounded like a telemarketer. And they thought just because they have this huge name that just everybody would sign up, and they get a lot of people, but they were losing, you're talking tens of millions of dollars a month because they really had no sales process. Every salesperson was reading off the script and just winging it from there. And they were losing about 30% of their salespeople every quarter, just churning them, churn and burn, And so you'd be surprised. You're talking about huge companies like that. And a lot of them really don't have a sales process, or they don't have a sales process that actually works.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's a lot more I'm sure we could cover on process, and hopefully people have left with some good takeaways and they can follow what you're doing a little bit later and dig a lot further into that. Back to kind of like sales hiring, I just want to give that a little more due before we move on. And thinking about that first sales hire, if you're an owner, there's just so many different places you can go with that, right? In terms of the skill sets, like you could hire somebody that has industry knowledge, you could hire somebody that's really smart and can stay ahead of the consultative edge, or you could hire somebody that's killing it selling Toyotas right now, and they're just like got their game down really good, have really good poise. Like what would you look for? Like how do you deal with that process?
Well, if I'm a business owner outside of our company, because we only hire clients who've gone through our sales
let's
training.
say B2B selling into big companies.
Yeah, so you're going to hire a couple things. You're going to hire somebody that's extremely hungry, that wants to make a lot of money. Okay, you don't want to hire somebody that's just like, oh well, yeah, I want an 80% base, and like those type of salespeople. When a salesperson says that they want most of their money in a base, that is a red flag that says they don't really think they know how to sell. Let's just be real, right? Because when I would go into companies, because my first job was door to door, right, B2C, then I got hired into selling debt relief services for 2 very large companies. So completely different, door to door to B2B, selling, $1 million, $10 million deals bigger. Then I went back to B2C and then another B2B. So when I would negotiate with companies at that point, they would be like, hey, we want to put you on a 50% base and commissions. I'm like, no. I don't want any base. I want 0 base. I want this type of percentage on my commission. And they're like, what? Like, yeah, okay. Because I knew I'd make 10 times more. So when salespeople say they want huge bases as a business owner, that should be a massive red flag to you. Okay. If they're really, really good, they want mainly, I'm not saying they can't have any type of base, but they want most of it in commissions because they know there's not a ceiling there. So you want somebody that's hungry financially to make a lot of money because they're going to get out and do the work. If they're not really hungry to make a lot of money and they just want this big base, they're not going to do much. Everybody knows that, right? You also want somebody that's willing to learn new skills. Like a lot of times salespeople, we always say low 6-figure salespeople have huge egos because they think they know everything about selling. And that keeps them stuck at 150,000 a year or 200,000 a year. They never can advance higher because they're never willing to learn more advanced skills to make that type of money. So you want to hire somebody that's hungry, somebody that's dedicated, somebody who wants to learn new skills. We typically even like to hire younger salespeople because sometimes when we hire older salespeople that maybe are in their 50s or something, which, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm in my 40s now. I'm about to be there. But a lot of them are so set in their ways that they just never want to learn how to sell better. They just like, oh, this is the way I've always done it. So I'm always, they got the horse blinders on. So sometimes you got to find somebody that's willing to learn, step outside of the box, willing to do new things, hungry professionally, they're driven, and they want to make a lot of money. That type of person, male or female, doesn't matter. Short, tall, doesn't matter. That type of person is really going to help you take the company to a new level.
I think that's a really good point, and it's not necessarily based on industry or anything like that. I think you've kind of highlighted the stuff that's hard to teach and needs to be in place. So Jeremy, I'd like to make you the first, inaugural guest for a new segment that I've shamelessly stolen from Conversations with Tyler, which is a great podcast, Tyler Cowan, called Overrated, Underrated. I'll say a phrase. You let me know overrated, underrated, properly rated, and why. Rapid fire. Got about a dozen of these. Are you ready?
Okay, let's do it.
Trade shows.
Overrated.
Inbound leads.
Underrated.
Cool. And you could say why too if you want. Even.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So trade shows, I just, unless you have good skills when they come up to you and talk to you, and you have like a really good, I don't even like to call it a follow-up process, because I hate using the F word of sales, follow up, because you never want to say, oh, I'm just calling to follow up, John, because you might as well be saying like, I'm just calling to take your money, John, because that's what the prospect hears. So I'm going to relanguage those type words. I'm just getting back to you. There's different ways you could do that. But I think trade shows, I just don't see a lot of salespeople do that well with trade shows. I just don't. As far as underrated, inbound leads are great because they kind of already know they have a problem. They don't really know all their problems, because most prospects don't, but they kind of already know they have something. That's why they take the time to book on the calendar.
Makes sense. LinkedIn.
Depends on the industry. I'm going to say overrated. And it's typically because as salespeople trying to reach out to their prospects, they're just horrible at doing it, right? So they're just like, hey, how you doing today? I saw that you're in XYZ, I do this A, B, and C, and then they just never do anything. So you got to learn how to prospect on LinkedIn. And then I think it's a good platform. But if you're just doing what everybody else does, you're not going to do that. You're not going to get many leads from it.
Makes sense. New sales hires reading books about sales.
Underrated, because psychologically, you only retain about 3% of the book. You've got to get into more sales training courses and group training. That type of thing, statistically, is going to help you remember and retain and know how to use it. A book doesn't teach you any type of tonality. It's mainly theory, for sure. Most sales books, I've read over 1,400 books on sales, persuasion, influence in the last 22 years. I read 5 books a month. 3 I read, 2 on audio, religiously since I was 21 years old. Brian Tracy taught me that. That's the first event I ever went to. Use your car, University on Wheels, read 3 to 5 books. And like the next day, I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. So that's what I keep doing. And I would say 95% of them are just basic theory.
Yeah, that makes sense. Industry knowledge.
Underrated. I think the more knowledge you have and the more you talk about your knowledge to the prospect, talking is the key word, what I just said there. The more it goes over their head and it stays logical, and the more think about it, I need to do more research, I need to keep looking around, objections you're going to get. If you have knowledge, you change the knowledge, you change your statements into questions that allow the prospect to come up with their own answers in their mind. That's why the very best psychologist in the world can charge $1,000 or $2,000 an hour, because they don't tell their patient what they need to do to change. They ask questions that allow the patient to tell themselves why and how they need to change. So you want to learn how to be a salesperson that makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in commissions or more, you got to learn those type of skills. You got to learn how to work with human behavior.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. CRM and software skills.
Depends on the industry. I'm going to say underrated. I think for salespeople, they struggle with that. So if that's really important, I think it is important for the company to have that. But I think you need to hire admin people to help your top salespeople to do that. When I was in B2B sales, I hated that type of stuff. They're like, dude, this guy's selling, $40-50 million worth of product for us every freaking year. We're going to hire him like 2 admin staff to like do all that other stuff so he can just sell. So if you want your salespeople to really focus on selling rather than 2 hours a day of like inputting data, hire somebody for $15 an hour that can do that and let them freaking sell.
Yeah, makes sense. Knowledge of competition.
I'm kind of in the middle on that. I'm going to say that it depends on the industry. I'm going to say it's overrated, but I'm kind of neutral on that one, because I think it's more of an industry specific question. Like if you're in B2B sales and every prospect you're talking to, they're also talking to 6 other competitors. That's a lot different than, let's say, if you sold life insurance and most of the time they're not really talking to other people, or if you're selling like pest control.
Yeah.
They're not talking to 6 different pest control companies most times. So I think that's industry specific. B2B, I think you need to have knowledge of your competitors. B2C, not as much.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's interesting. Role-playing exercises in the context of sales training.
Underrated. It's very, very important. For you to learn advanced tonality and how you sound, how you come across to your prospect, you have to have somebody that you can role play with it that actually can point that out. Okay. If you're just reading books and then, calls, you don't know what you really sound like. So, in some of our advanced sales training programs that we have in group exercises, we do call reviews, like call breakdowns. in front of groups of like hundreds of different types of salespeople from different industries, and they pick up tons of things. They're like, oh my gosh, I sound like a scripted robot, and it helps everybody out. So role playing is extremely important if you want to scale your companies with your salespeople.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the last one for now, ride-alongs.
Depending on if the person riding along with you is really good at sales and can actually train you. If they suck, which a lot of people do in ride-alongs, a lot of managers sometimes do. I'm not saying everybody. Okay. So if you're hearing me, don't be a hater out there, guys. Some people are good at it, but if the ride-along is good, if you can train the salesperson, I think it's important for sure. But if it's just like a manager that really doesn't know how to sell and they're giving advice, not so good.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think this was a success. I think we might make this a permanent
I like
segment
the
of the show.
overrated, underrated thing. That's actually pretty neat, actually.
Yeah, it's a good steal from Tyler. So Jeremy, this was so much fun, man. How can people follow what you're up to and get involved in all
So
that good
hey,
stuff?
yeah, we'll give them a little hors d'oeuvre here. So if you want to look at kind of what we do, if you want to get some free resources to help your people sell more, you can go to our Facebook group. So we'll send them to this Facebook group. We have many. Go to www.salesrevolution.pro. So I think we gave you the link, salesrevolution.pro. Right when you join, check your DMs. Somebody on my team will message over to you a free training called the NEPQ 101 mini course. It is our CEO, Matt Ryder, breaking down the steps of neuro-emotional persuasion questioning, NEPQ. And he's going to give you an overview of some different questions. That alone will probably help you make more sales than what you are now without really knowing what's going on. And we go live in that Facebook group about 3 to 4 different times a week, different trainings, subject matters, different Q&As. And then if they want to learn more advanced training that like our clients are in, they can just always message us in the group and somebody can reach out for sure.
Awesome. That sounds like a great resource, and we'll get that linked up. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time, man. Really appreciate it.
Hey, I enjoyed being on the show. Enjoy that fall weather in New York. I'm actually really jealous. It's still hot here in Arizona.
Well, come on out, man. Yeah, there's plenty of room. So
all right. Yeah, there's plenty of room. That's right.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.